Yes, Ms. Richards.
Professor Keel, we'd looked before the break at Lord Fraser's December 1994 letter about the look-back exercise. If we pick matters up in early 1995, please. Lawrence, could we have PRSE 00031115? This is a letter dated the 6th of January 1995. It's from Professor Cash to Mr. McIntosh, the General Manager SNBTS. And if we go over the page, we can see it was copied to, amongst others, Mr. Tucker and to you. If we go back to the first page, please. I just want to pick it up in the penultimate paragraph where Professor Cash says this: I still believe a simultaneous UK approach to HCV look-back has much to commend it for the patients' and donors' sake, and indeed various responsible institutions. If we get significantly out of synchronisation with the rest of the UK, there could be some quite worrying developments. And then he suggests that it may be appropriate to continue with current planning processes. Do you have any understanding, did you have any at the time of receiving this, do you have any now, of what Professor Cash was referring to when he talked about there being some quite worrying developments if Scotland was significantly out of synchronisation with the rest of the UK?
No, I have no idea what he means.
And then if we pick it up next in January at DHSC 003208_136. Now, this is a letter from Tom Sackville, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Department of Health, to Lord Fraser, 4th of January 1995, and it's obviously in response to the letter Lord Fraser had written. I just want to invite your observations on the last paragraph on this page, where Mr. Sackville says this: I understand your wish to move quickly in Scotland to put in hand the look-back exercise. I hope, however, you will recognise the overwhelming advantage of us moving forward on a UK-wide basis. Any piecemeal approach, quite apart from giving all the wrong signals and causing confusion to the public, will seriously compromise the government's defence that we've acted as quickly as possible on the basis of the best advice available and uniformly. Now, it might well be said, having regard to that paragraph, that a principal reason put forward by the Department of Health to Lord Fraser for a UK-wide approach rather than Scotland going first was to, as it says there, avoid compromising the government's defence of acting as quickly as possible. Do you have any recollection of whether that piece of reasoning was known to you or discussed within the Scottish Home and Health Department at the time?
I'm afraid I don't recollect that. I'm not sure if I was aware of it. I don't remember any discussion about it.
Okay. May I just ask, did it strike you at the time that the last 4 lines are effectively saying, we want to say we acted as quickly as possible, so we're going to ask you to act more slowly? That is what it's saying, isn't it, in effect?
I think that's a valid interpretation, yes. However, we have to remember that Lord Fraser really had an imperative based on the legal advice he'd received.
This isn't a criticism of Lord Fraser, it's a criticism of the logic of the last 4 lines, seeking to maintain a line which is we acted as quickly as we could. And in order to maintain that line, say to someone else, slow down a bit, please. It's a comment, really. I'll leave it there.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say we don't know whether Professor Keel would have seen this letter at the time.
No.
I don't know whether, Professor, you were able to recall that or not.
No, it's really a question ultimately for those who wrote it rather than those who received it, I think.
And then just to pick up on, to complete the exchange of correspondence, Lord Fraser's response back to Mr Sackville, DHSC 0002551_110. This is Lord Fraser, 9th of January 1995, responding to the letter that we've just looked at. We can see he says in the second paragraph, I'm glad you've given the go-ahead for a look-back exercise in England. I too hope colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland will also give similar approval. While the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service is already under instruction to proceed, I agree that there are benefits to be gained from a common UK approach, and I've asked my officials to ensure that there is maximum cooperation and harmonisation of arrangements. The next paragraph refers to the setting up of a working party and wanting Scottish clinicians to be involved. I understand, Professor Keel, that you were a member of that working party, the ad hoc working party on the look back.
Yes, indeed.
And then the last paragraph on this page says, with regard to an announcement, I'm content for this to be made on a UK basis by an inspired PQ. The press statement should indicate I've asked the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service to take the look-back exercise forward in Scotland in consultation with the other blood transfusion services in the UK. And then it suggests that there'll be a separate statement issued after 3:30 p.m. on the 11th of January. So whether or not you would have seen Mr Sackville's letter to Lord Fraser, is it likely that you would have seen Lord Fraser's letter back to Mr Sackville at the time?
Yes, I think it would be likely.
And what we can see from this is that Lord Fraser is now agreeing to Scotland, or the timing of Scotland's introduction matching the timing of England's introduction. Is it right then to understand that although there had been, as we've seen, contemplation of Scotland going it alone earlier than the rest of the United Kingdom, that did not in fact happen?
Well, I think we have to remember here that all of this really started off in the autumn, I think, with the September meeting of MSBT, and then the December meeting where DH agreed that they would be going to their ministers to seek agreement to the look back. So there wasn't really a big gap between that meeting and this correspondence taking place, or indeed the announcement of the look back early in January. I think what has to be borne in mind here that any perceived delay was really about allowing the transfusion services, both in Scotland and England, to get their act together to operationalise the policy that had been agreed. And that was no mean undertaking, as I've already hinted earlier on in my evidence today.
We can take that down, thank you. I'll turn from the timing of the look back then to the scope of the look back, Professor Keel, and invite your attention back to your witness statement, WITN 5736003, page 21, please, Lawrence. And you will see at the bottom of the page the question that was posed to you at question 39. Why, to the best of your knowledge, was the decision taken to limit the look-back exercise to those donors who had returned to give blood after September 1991? What consideration, if any, was given to how recipients who'd been infected by a donor who'd not subsequently donated might be identified? And if we go over the page to your response, you say this: my recollection is that there was general agreement that extending the exercise to recipients of blood donated by donors who did not return would be logistically extremely difficult for the blood transfusion service. The view was that any benefit would be disproportionate to the effort required by both the BTS and the wider NHS. Instead, it was agreed that individuals who'd received a transfusion prior to HCV testing being introduced in 1991 should be offered a test as the most effective way of addressing this issue. If we leave aside that last sentence for the moment, Professor Keel, you refer there to your recollection of general agreement as to the scope of the exercise. Was it recognised, as far as you can recall at the time, that setting the parameters of the look back in the way that the UK did would mean that there would be potentially a significant number of individuals who had been infected with hepatitis C, but who would not be identified?
Yes, I don't know whether we felt there would be a significant number who would be missed by not extending it to those donors who didn't return. But it certainly was recognised, and the thinking was that the best way to deal with those individuals was really to raise awareness as far as possible that anybody who'd received a transfusion prior to 1991 could come forward and ask for a test. And that indeed is what happened, that publicity.
And can you recall, in relation to that last point, Professor, what steps were taken at this point? So we're talking now about the mid-90s and the course of the remainder of the 90s. What steps were taken to publicise this issue in Scotland so that individuals who had received a transfusion might be aware of the possibility of having been infected and of the availability of a test for them?
It certainly was contained in, I think, a CMO letter to Directors of Public Health. Now, I'm really finding it difficult to recall quite what the vehicle was, but I do remember at least one letter suggesting that if anybody came forward who had been transfused, they should automatically be offered a test. And that view was certainly also promulgated, I think, through committees to the general practitioner community.
Excuse me. And for the sake of completeness, if we just look at PRSE 40412, this was the Scottish CMO's letter announcing the scheme, or drawing the scheme to the attention of general practitioners, 11th of January 1995. We see reference in the first paragraph to the announcement of the look back, and then the second paragraph to the action that was going to be taken by blood transfusion centres. We just go a little further down that paragraph. So there's reference halfway down that long paragraph to a helpline being set up for members of the public who want further information about HCV and blood transfusion and the look-back exercise. And then reference to the likelihood that some patients would turn to GPs for information and reassurance. So that's certainly one communication by the CMO to GPs. Is it your recollection that there were further communications?
I thought there were, but maybe I'm wrong at this distance. I can't be sure.
You may be right, Professor Keel. It was intentionally an open question, and we can no doubt check the position ourselves. Do you recall whether there were any broader public awareness campaigns in the second half of the 1990s in relation to hepatitis C and how to recognise the symptoms and the importance of coming forward to one's GP?
No, I don't recall any.
An issue arose in the course of the look back about extending it to non-haemophiliacs who had received DFIX. Is that right? And we can pick that up just, I think, with a couple of letters. SBTS 303833_084, please. This was Professor Ludlam raising the issue with you in May 1995. And if we just look at the text of the letter, he said in the first paragraph, as it's been decided that there should be a look back in relation to the transfusion of fresh blood components prepared from possible hepatitis C positive donors, I think it would also be appropriate to assess non-haemophilic individuals who received DFIX. Reasonable to confine this to those who required it for warfarin reversal because it's likely that patients with liver disease requiring PCCs will no longer be alive. And he suggested a pilot study, perhaps in Edinburgh, in his second paragraph. Now, that didn't happen, as I understand it, the extension of the scheme. Again, if I just ask you to look at one letter and then I can invite your comment on it. DHSC 0002557_005. And I think there'd been some further correspondence in the interim, but you then wrote to Professor Ludlam 23rd of October 1995 on this issue. You refer to it having been discussed again at the most recent meeting of the ad hoc working party, and then you say this: it was pointed out that the initial terms of reference for that working party referred to a look back involving blood and unfractionated blood products only. Any revision of these terms of reference would therefore require a ministerial decision. The working party thought it would not be logical to extend the look back only to DFIX, as clearly other fractionated blood products also had the potential to transmit HCV prior to 1991. The working party were also concerned about the enormous logistical difficulties in extending the look back. And then the last sentence of that paragraph refers to implicit in the whole look back exercise is the understanding that any individual who's received blood products not covered by the exercise prior to September 91 and who may be concerned about his or her HCV status can request an HCV test. As far as you can recall, is that how that issue then rested? It wasn't essentially a matter for the working party because their remit didn't extend to use of products in that way, and the matter was left there?
As far as I recollect, I suspect there may have been ongoing discussions, but the main point in this letter is I refer to the enormous logistical difficulties in extending look back in this way, because DFIX was a fractionated blood product which was widely used not to address factor deficiencies, but to reverse the effects of warfarin and other coumarin anticoagulants, where people had too much warfarin and were at risk of bleeding. So that would have been tens of thousands of patients. So the volume is one thing, but more importantly is the lack of a link between the prescription of DFIX for that purpose in any centralized database. There was no way of identifying, other than going through loads, thousands of medical records, whether people had received this product or not. So I think, again, the view, widely held view, was that it would be impossible to do this without really imposing an enormous burden particularly on the NHS.
Was any consideration given either to a public education campaign in relation to this cohort of patients, identifying the possibility of being able to request an HCV test, or a CMO letter to GPs or others flagging this up as an issue?
Not that I recollect.
Can I then turn to the course of the look back and pick that up with a progress report? If we go to NHBT 0088395, so this is, it looks like it's a progress report for the MSBT. We can see top of the page it says MSBT 25th of May 1995, HCV Look Back Scottish Progress Report. And then the position is set out in relation to the north. It said all donations have been traced back as far as records would allow. In relation to the west, it says this: concern has been expressed by West of Scotland consultant haematologists at the amount of time and effort the look back process will demand of them. Apparently the chair of that group will be writing to Dr. Keel to request that SOHHD provide funding for this work. Do you know what happened in relation to that request? Was it made and granted?
I don't remember. I suspect if funding was requested, I would have referred the writer of the letter back to their board to look for additional funding if required. But I think the point that strikes me here is what I've already mentioned about the west of Scotland and the fact that right from the beginning, they felt that, and not surprisingly, because they supply blood to half of Scotland, that the amount of effort that they were going to have to put into the look back exercise would be much greater than the other transfusion services, and equally, by extrapolation, that what they would be asking for from NHS consultants in terms of haematologists would be greater in proportion than the rest of the country.
And then if we look at the northeast, it refers to the donations having been traced back. And then the second paragraph says this: reluctance encountered on the part of consultant haematologists and GPs with respect to seeing patients. Of those contacted, 40% have agreed to do so, but 40% have declined and 20% have not responded. In these latter instances, NERTC will undertake counselling. And there's a reference to Professor Cash going to following that matter up with Trust General managers. Were any steps taken, to your knowledge, by SHHD to try and address this apparent reluctance on the part of haematologists and GPs? Because otherwise, as we see from this, the burden of counselling was going to fall on the regional transfusion centre, rather than what might be thought to be the more appropriate route of the doctors and GPs involved.
Well, I certainly agree with you that that would have been the most appropriate route, but I can't remember whether we made any efforts to get consultants and GPs more engaged with the counselling aspects of the exercise. I suspect we did, but I can't honestly say that I remember what those actions were.
And then we can see in relation to the east, all donations have been traced back to 1985 patients not yet contacted. Southeast, all relevant donations traced, all recipients contacted, which may reflect the advantages the Southeast had that you've already referred to, Professor. And then the summary: implementation process has been problematic. Apparent delays/misunderstandings in receipt of documentation from SOHHD and typographical/factual errors in content of standard letters. However, good progress is being made. Is that summary consistent with your recollection of how matters were proceeding by this point in time? This is May 1995.
Yes, so still relatively early in the process. So yes, this would be my recollection. Not unexpectedly, problems encountered. But I think you can see from the numbers that good progress was indeed being made.
And I think if we pick it up in a document from the same month, but it provides a little more detail, it's SBTS 40463_005. This is a meeting of the SNBTS Medical and Scientific Committee, 17th of May 1995, attended by you. And the look-back discussion starts on page 5. We can see, bottom half of the page, under the first paragraph, again, it refers to problematic implementation and difficulties with documents. And then it says this, for example, in the North East region, letters have gone from SHHD to GPs, but not hospital MOs, which resulted in numerous phone calls to the RTC. Do you know what that issue referred to?
Obviously, a mistake was made, but I can't remember any more detail than what's recorded here.
But it records that nevertheless good progress being made, and then over the page, I'm not going to read any of this out. There's in some respects, a slightly more detailed account of the progress, which complements what was set out in the document we looked at previously. If we then pick matters up in 1996, so the following year, DHSC 0004469_013. This is a report from Dr. Metters, so the Deputy Chief Medical Officer in England, to the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Health in England, dated the 5th of February 1996. It's an interim report on the look-back exercise. If we go to the bottom of the second page, we look at paragraphs 10 and 11. So under the heading Reasons for Slow Progress, paragraph 10, members of the MSBT considered why the exercise was taking longer than originally envisaged. They identified two particular bottlenecks. One was tracing medical records for recipients identified in the hospital blood banks, and secondly, a shortage of counsellors available to see patients prior to and post testing. The MSBT accepted that if both of these areas of difficulty were overcome, it was likely that the hepatology services for specialist assessment and, where appropriate, commencement of treatment would probably not be able to cope. Now, that's picking matters up from an MSBT meeting, which obviously was a UK-wide meeting. But in relation to the position in Scotland, what's your recollection, if any, of the extent to which those two bottlenecks identified in paragraph 10 were problematic in Scotland at this time?
I think there were probably similar difficulties identified in Scotland, particularly on the shortage of counsellors. But, I mean, I don't have any specific recollection of discussions. And clearly this was a meeting of MSBT, and I guess these bottlenecks were identified across the whole of the UK.
And then in relation to the point in paragraph 11, the potential difficulty for hepatology services, both in terms of assessment and commencement of treatment, what's your recollection of the position in Scotland in that regard?
Well, there would have been anxiety about the numbers emerging from the look-back exercise who might be eligible for treatment. And worries about the hepatology services being overwhelmed. My recollection is that in the event that didn't happen, but I mean, obviously there were significant numbers even in Scotland emerging from the look back exercise at this point. So if they were going to be, not all of them, but a number of them referred on to secondary care for assessment, you can envisage that maybe the service wouldn't at that point have been geared up to delivering what was a newish treatment to a wider cohort of patients.
If we move matters forward to 1998 then, and look at PRSC 303277, we can see that Professor Franklin, who was by this time the National Medical and Scientific Director of SNBTS, wrote to you on the 28th of April 1998 and said this in the first paragraph: at a recent meeting of the SNBTS Medical and Scientific Committee, we once again reviewed the status of the HCV look-back exercise. Over the past months, progress with this has been virtually static. As you will see on the attached summary sheet prepared by Jack Gillen, we still have a number of patients whom we've been unable to trace, and conclude that without additional resources from SOHD, doing so is not going to be possible. And then there's a reference to then a particular issue in relation to RIBA indeterminates. And then the third paragraph says, it's therefore the view of the SNBTS MSC that the current HCV look-back should be considered to be closed, unless, of course, SOHD feel that it should resource one final effort to conclude every possible case. Did the Scottish Health Department feel able to resource that one final effort referred to by Professor Franklin, as far as you can recall?
I don't remember additional resources being made available, but I do know that SNBTS were strongly encouraged before a policy decision was made here to have a final effort at tracing these recipients. But I don't know. Well, I do know that no additional resource was found from within government. Whether additional resource was found within SNBTS, I suspect the answer to that would be yes, because they did go ahead with a final push.
And we can see, we don't need to put the next document up on screen, but just for the record, you raised this matter at an MSBT meeting on the 4th of June 1998. The reference for the transcript is DHSC 0004026_033. And then you wrote back to Professor Franklin after that MSBT meeting, if we could have this on screen, please, Lawrence, PRSE 0004337. 10th of June, you wrote to Professor Franklin in these terms: as you know, this was on the agenda at the meeting of MSBT on the 4th of June, and the specific issue of whether SNBTS should draw a line under the look-back exercise was discussed. There was general agreement that all reasonable measures have been taken to trace components and recipients in Scotland, and that the tracing exercise could therefore stop. However, it was also agreed that the look-back exercise could not be considered formally closed until reasons for non-traceability of components or recipients have been logged on the look-back register. There's still a great deal of work to be done throughout the UK in this area, and Angela Robinson did make the point that it's labour-intensive. Nevertheless, ministers will need to be satisfied that the reasons for non-follow-up of components and recipients are very clearly documented and justifiable. I would therefore ask that SNBTS continue their efforts to provide this information to the register, as the look-back exercise cannot be considered complete until this has been accomplished. So what further work did that anticipate needed to be undertaken by SNBTS?
think it was really just a documentation of who had been traced through the look back to make sure that all those details were recorded and that the reasons for being unable to trace components or recipients had been logged on what was at that point a developing UK look-back register. And that actually has provided the basis for long-term follow-up of recipients identified by the look-back exercise. It's a very valuable database, if you like. So we were all very keen that the data recorded on the register was as complete as possible.
Did the data recorded on the look-back register include, and it sounds from your answer a moment ago as though it would, patient identifying information? In other words, it had the details of patients and personal
Yes.
data relating to them.
Yes.
Was that something which patients, obviously not people who had not been traced, but patients who had been traced, was their consent sought to the inclusion of that information on the look-back register?
I don't know. I imagine it was, but I wasn't involved in that level of detail as to whether. I mean, I'm sure that those who were speaking to recipients of components would have made them aware that there was a UK database being developed. But whether they got explicit consent, I don't know.
And then can I ask you to look, just going back in time to 1995 now, in relation to the look back, at SBTS 0003833_421. This is a letter from you dated the 10th of May 1995 to an Edinburgh GP. I don't propose to read the first two paragraphs. The last paragraph says this: some GPs will undoubtedly be involved in helping to trace patients and in some cases organising anti-HCV testing and providing initial counselling. However, given that the total number of traceable anti-HCV positive recipients is expected to be 300 for the whole of Scotland, the burden for individual practices is unlikely to be great. My departmental colleagues with responsibility for primary care have had no queries whatsoever on this issue. I personally have had only one or two telephone inquiries regarding the general principles of the look-back and none relating to the question of additional funding for GPs for taking part in the look-back exercise. Just pausing there, do you know what the basis was for the estimate of 300 traceable anti-HCV positive recipients for the whole of Scotland?
Probably not a very accurate recollection, but I imagine that it was an exercise involving all of the regional transfusion centres, probably based on the numbers that Jack Gillen's pilot had identified in southeast Scotland.
And then commenting on this letter in your witness statement, so if we go back to WITN 5736003, page 22, it's the penultimate paragraph, A41. So you refer to the letter that we just looked at and explain you don't have access to his original letter. And then you, I think, summarise a couple of the points that you made in the letter. And then you say this in the last sentence of this paragraph of your statement: against this background, it was not felt necessary to provide additional information and or training on HCV to GPs. And Professor Keel, one of the themes of a lot of the evidence this inquiry has heard is about the lack of knowledge on the part of general practitioners about hepatitis C, its symptoms, and the potential link between blood or blood products and development of hepatitis C. Was any work undertaken in the 1990s by the Scottish Home and Health Department to try and glean what the level of understanding was amongst GPs in Scotland about hepatitis C?
None that I recollect, but that doesn't mean there weren't any efforts. For example, the primary care division, which looked after GP business, may have done something in this area, but I don't know.
We can take that down, thank you. Do you recollect now how the look back that in Scotland was funded? Was it funded out of existing budgets by SNBTS and the relevant health boards, or was any additional funding made available by SHHD?
My recollection is the former.
And then it was obviously recognised that this look back would not identify every patient positive with hepatitis C. Was any epidemiological modelling or other work undertaken at the time in order to try and estimate the numbers of patients who might conceivably be being missed?
I remember SNBTS involving SCIA, the Scottish Centre for Infection and Environmental Health, and specifically Professor David Bloomberg, who's an expert on bloodborne virus epidemiology. I think SNBTS commissioned some work from him in this area. And I think DH definitely did from a different individual.
I'm going to move now, Professor Keel, to a separate topic, and that's the question of the provision of financial support or assistance, compensation, however one wants to term it, although those are obviously different concepts, for those infected with hepatitis C from blood or blood products. Now, before we look at any specific documents, is this the position that when you came into post in 1992, there existed within the Scottish Home and Health Department an existing policy or line to take that financial support would not be made available to those infected with hepatitis C?
Yes.
I'm going to pick the picture up then in 1995. If we look first of all at SCGV 0000165_046. Now, this is a letter dated the 25th of May 1995. It's addressed to Roger Schofield in the NHS Executive at the Department of Health, and it's from Ian Snedden. And we can see from the first paragraph that he has replaced George Tucker. Mr. Snedden is responding to a letter from Roger Schofield about proposals to institute a payment scheme for those infected with hepatitis C through blood and blood products. And the letter says as follows: I've now had the opportunity to discuss the proposals with the department's medical and legal advisors, and we are of the view that the scheme as it is proposed would give rise to a number of complex legal and medical questions. I can advise you that the consensus which emerged from these initial considerations was that whilst the no compensation position was becoming increasingly untenable, the proposals to link payments to social needs and the degree of harm suffered would be very difficult to establish, and the clinical judgments required would also make it costly and complex to administer. In the circumstances, I feel I'm therefore obliged to seek the views of our ministers before we respond substantively. In particular, I'm sure that Lord Fraser, our Minister for Health and Home Affairs, would wish to consider these proposals carefully given his earlier involvement when he was formerly Lord Advocate with the HIV settlement scheme. We will try to obtain the views of ministers as quickly as possible. I hope the inevitable delay does not cause too much difficulty in dealing with a subject which I'm aware is creating pressure on all UK health departments. I will, of course, inform you of our ministers' views as soon as these are known. So this letter suggests that there have been some initial discussions within the department, including the department's medical and legal advisors. Is it likely, given the subject matter of this, that that would have included you?
Probably.
The reference in the paragraph beginning, I've now had the opportunity, to the consensus being that the no compensation position was becoming increasingly untenable. What can you recall about that consensus and the reasons why it was thought to be increasingly untenable?
Well, the consensus, I believe, arose from the view that notwithstanding the HIV assistance scheme that had already been in place for a number of years, that making an exception to provide assistance, financial assistance to sufferers of HCV acquired through transfusion would be inequitable to other patient groups already out there who might feel that they had an equal claim to such assistance. However, the untenability, I think, arises from the fact that there was an increasing degree of lobbying from organisations such as the Hemophilia Society to make such payments available.
Now, we can see Mr Snedden was going to seek the views of ministers before responding substantively. And if we turn to SCGV 0000165_035, we can see the minute, or at least a draft of the minute, that was provided by Mr Snedden to the Minister of State. It's dated June 1995, and we can see that the recipients to whom it's copied include, towards the bottom of that list, you, Professor Keel. If we just look at paragraph 1, first of all, this minute explains that ministers at the Department of Health have asked officials to prepare proposals for a scheme to compensate those infected with HCV through blood or blood products, but without any presumption that such a scheme would be desirable or inevitable. The Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland offices have all been asked to comment on their proposals, and I'm seeking the Minister's agreement to respond in terms of, and then there's reference to a draft letter. If we go over the page, there's a section headed background. If we just look at the bottom of the page, there are some amendments because this is a draft. Is that your handwriting, Professor Keel?
It is.
So you would undoubtedly have seen this draft and you're commenting on it there in relation to the some of the medical background. If we go to the next page, we can see reference to, at the bottom of the page, to media and political interest, and the reference there to the Panorama programme and the Haemophilia Society campaign. And then the last three lines say, we've had a number of green folders and letters for official reply on the matter over the past 9 months, and we've dealt with 2 PQs tabled by Dr Norman Godman for written reply on the 16th of June. What's the reference, if you know, Professor Keel, to the green folders and letters for official reply?
Gosh, racking my brains. I I'm not absolutely clear. I think green folders were maybe correspondence from members of Parliament, but I'm not absolutely sure.
In any event, it's recording, is this fair, increasing public and political interest in this issue.
Yes, indeed.
If we go over the page, there's reference under the heading legal action to a test case in Scotland. As far as you can recall, did you have any involvement in advising in relation to that case?
Not that I recall.
And then paragraph 10 refers to legal action against Baxter, a private pharmaceutical company. Do you have any knowledge about those claims?
Only what's written here, I'm afraid.
We've then got the heading no fault compensation. And it's said and underlined, establishing a no-fault compensation scheme would be contrary to the position which the government has taken to date. Government's opposed no-fault compensation for 5 reasons. Now, I'm not going to take you through each of those reasons, Professor, but if we can go over to the top of the next page. Just wanted to ask your view, first of all, about what's said at D. It refers to negligence in the healthcare field, says it's not considered to be fundamentally different from negligence in any other walk of life, where claims of compensation are resolved through the courts. And then this, the present system arguably has a deterrent effect on malpractice, and no-fault compensation could conceivably make doctors less careful. As a doctor yourself and a medical advisor to the SHHD, was that a view which you shared?
Well, insofar as I agreed it was a theoretical risk, but I mean, I didn't really feel that the introduction of a no-fault compensation scheme would lead to my colleagues casting all care to the winds and being cavalier in their practice. But it definitely was a theoretical argument.
And then below paragraph E, it says this, the main argument against compensation is that the treatment offered was the best available in the light of medical knowledge at the time. And then there's reference to the issue about the introduction of the test for hepatitis C and it being introduced earlier in other countries. Again, is that your handwriting on the right-hand side, Professor Keel?
Yes.
So I think you say, worth detailing relative dates of introduction of HCV testing in other countries, or would this only complicate the issue further?
That's exactly right, yes.
Can I then just pick up that sentence about the argument, the main argument being that the treatment offered was the best available in the light of medical knowledge at the time? Now that reflects a line to take that this inquiry has seen in documentation emanating from the Department of Health in the 1990s, the Department of Health in England. Was it your view as the medical advisor with responsibility for this issue in Scotland that the treatment had been the best available in the light of medical knowledge at the time? And if so, what was that based on?
Yes, it was my view. And I think the internal report that SHHD carried out in, I think, about 2000 into the efforts made by the blood transfusion services in the UK, both the Protein Fractionation Centre and the Bioproducts Lab south of the border, in introducing or discovering how to treat plasma products so that you inactivated certain viruses. I think that demonstrates the absolute complexity of this field. So the coagulation factors that were being given to, let's say, hemophilia patients prior to the introduction of testing were state of the art at the time. It wasn't until, unfortunately, 1987 that SNBTS began to produce a product called Z8, which was HCV safe and in sufficient quantities to supply all of the needs in Scotland. However, that didn't mean that they were not putting their very best efforts in, as were BPL south of the border, to developing viral products that were virus safe, be it from HIV or hepatitis C. So yes, I do strongly believe that at the time, the products being used, although in looking forward or looking back, obviously they contained viruses, but nonetheless they were the best available treatment at the time. And indeed, they had revolutionized the treatment of hemophilia. In the 1960s, for example, the mean age of death of a hemophiliac individual was 37. By the 1980s, hemophiliacs had a nearly normal lifespan because of the introduction of factor VIII and IX products, which saved them from dying of bleeding, saved them from disabling complications of bleeds, particularly into joints. So yes, I strongly support that sentence.
So I note the time. There's various matters I want to pick up with Professor Keel, both in relation to her last answer and the rest of this document. But I'm conscious that the fire alarm is going to go off where Professor Keel is in a couple of minutes. So if we bring forward the afternoon break, I can pick those questions up afterwards.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now. We'll come back at 3:25. So 3:25.